In this section, we're going to take a look at asymmetries within the cerebral hemispheres with a particular focus on language. So, start off with this concept of cerebral dominance. Now, cerebral dominance is a bit of an old-fashioned term, and I'd actually prefer to use the term cerebral lateralisation. Either way, what it refers to is asymmetry in the functions of the left and right cerebral hemispheres. So let's think about these, and let's think about the properties of the left and right cerebral hemispheres. But before we do that, let's think about how have people been able to work this out? Well, of course, we have patients who maybe have extensive damage to one hemisphere or another. And furthermore, there have been some fascinating studies performed on patients who have had their corpus callosum transected. And what that does is effectively dissociate the left from the right hemisphere, meaning that they can't communicate with each other. And if you're clever in the way that you exploit your knowledge of the visual fields, you're able to effectively interview each hemisphere separately and start to get an idea of the functional properties of each side of the brain. And some fantastic experiments have been performed on these patients. It's well worth reading some of these studies. Roger Sperry is the name that you should be looking up. The left hemisphere is known for its aptitude for sequential processing. So this being processing that occurs in a serial fashion. Language is a classic example of that, and we know that the language centres are in the left cerebral hemisphere. But furthermore, mathematical and logical abilities are thought to be primarily found within the left hemisphere. Whereas the right hemisphere is known to have an aptitude for what might be thought of as whole picture processing. It takes a more holistic approach to the way it sees the world. So the right hemisphere has a strong sense of body image. It has strong visuospatial awareness, has a relatively prominent emotional function, and also is believed to be important for musical abilities. Classically, we talk about the dominant hemisphere being the hemisphere that contains language, although each hemisphere is dominant for different things, as we've seen here. And as I say at the bottom of the screen, the left hemisphere is dominant, i.e. dominant for language, in about 95% of people. And the easiest way to remember that is that most of us are right-handed, the right hand being controlled by the left cerebral hemisphere. However, the correlation between handedness and language is actually a relatively poor one. And most left-handers still have a dominant left cerebral hemisphere for language. So it's not as simple as you might at first think. We said that the right hemisphere was important for visuospatial awareness, and this is related to the disorder known as neglect. And essentially, if you have a right parietal lobe lesion, then actually what you do is you fail to acknowledge the existence of the left half of the world, whereas a left parietal lobe lesion doesn't seem to tend to result in the same kind of syndrome. And the reason for that is that the right parietal lobe attends to both halves of space, whereas the left parietal lobe only attends to the right half of space. And if you think carefully about that, the consequence is that damage to the right parietal lobe will lead to loss of attention to the left half of space. Finally, don't think that these distinctions between the hemispheres are written in stone. They're actually very fluid and very plastic. And really, each hemisphere does have a certain element of all of these functions that are listed. So we do know, for example, that the right hemisphere in most people indeed has a rudimentary language function. So these are very much guidelines, if you like, tendencies, not absolutes. Now, the ability for the left and right hemispheres to work together, and the fact that we don't go around as effectively two separate people within one head, is the presence of this large fibre bundle called the Corpus Callosum. All right? The Corpus Callosum, we can see on this beautiful diffusion tensor imaging study on the left-hand side, creates a profuse set of connections between the left and right hemispheres. There are many tens of millions of axons in the Corpus Callosum, and interestingly, damage to the Corpus Callosum actually doesn't result in major obvious deficits in patients. It's probable that other pathways can take over from it, and also, thinking about, how does the left hand know what the right hand is doing? Well, if you're looking at both of the hands and you're glancing between them, both hemispheres can get an idea of what's going on. However, if you are clever and if you perform certain controlled experiments, you can start to see that loss of the corpus callosum can have some major impacts upon the function of patients. For example, if you present an image of an object to a patient's left visual field, they are not able to say the name of that object. Because if you think about it, if it's gone to the left visual field, it would go to the right occipital lobe, the right visual cortex, but then that information wouldn't be able to get back across to the left hemisphere that contains the language centers. So you can really start to uncover some fascinating and rather subtle deficits. From a clinical point of view, as I said, these patients don't get all that much in the way of deficits. However, there are conditions, for example, alien hand syndrome, where, for example, one hand might be doing up the buttons of a shirt, whilst the other hand mischievously starts to undo them. So there are some interesting disconnection syndromes related to damage to this structure. But when we talk about cerebral asymmetries, really what we're talking about is language. Language is the most important function which is asymmetrical within the brain. And as we've said before, language is primarily, in most people, found in the dominant or left hemisphere. And there are two important areas that are responsible for the correct processing of language. The first area is Broca's area. Broca's area sits just about here. Okay? So Broca's area is there. And Broca's area, which is in the sort of inferior lateral portion of the frontal lobe, is very important for the production of speech. The production of speech. This is a motor function. It's worthwhile asking yourself, why is Broca's area where it is? Well, look at what it's sitting next to. Here is the precentral gyrus, the site of the primary motor cortex. And on the lateral aspect of the precentral gyrus is where in the homunculus the face is represented. So Broca's area, which essentially is involved in directing the muscles to produce language, it makes sense to put it right next to the facial regions of the motor cortex so that we can economize on the amount of wiring needed to connect the two together. The second area that you need to be aware of is Wernicke's area. So let's just change color to show you that. Let's change to blue. Wernicke's area sits around about here. Okay. It is in the superior temporal lobe, but there's also, debates that it might also be present in the parietal lobe as well. But the majority of it is in the superior part of the temporal lobe. And Wernicke's area is very important for the interpretation of language. Very important for the interpretation of language. Why is it that Wernicke's area sits here in the superior temporal lobe? Well, the primary auditory cortex sits around about here. So it makes sense if you're going to have a region of the brain that decodes sounds into language, you'd site it close to the auditory cortex, the bit of the brain that's dealing with auditory stimuli. So Broca's area, important for the production of speech. Wernicke's area, important for the interpretation of speech. Now, these two regions are connected. They are connected together, and they're connected together by white matter known as the Arcuate Fasciculus. Okay? The Arcuate Fasciculus connects these two brain regions together. And in most models of language function, the Arcuate Fasciculus is thought to be unidirectional in that it goes from Wernicke's area, which does the understanding, the interpretation, to Broca's area that does the production of speech. So most interpretations of this system put the Arcuate Fasciculus as unidirectional. However, we do know that it is in fact bidirectional, but that really doesn't have major relevance for your clinical practice. It's best to realise to think of it as a unidirectional pathway. Now, what we're going to do next is we're going to think about the normal physiological roles of these structures in a variety of contexts. First context that we're going to think about is the pathway used for repeating a heard word. All right. Now, I'm not going to change my colours. I'm just going to use one colour here, mainly just because it gets a little bit cumbersome. But I'll use red here just so that it gives us a good amount of contrast. So the pathway for repeating a heard word. All right. So let's first of all put on Wernicke's area. So here's Wernicke's area here in the superior temporal lobe. Let's put on Broca's area just here in the inferolateral frontal lobe. So repeating a heard word. This auditory information is processed in the cortex within the primary auditory cortex, which is in this region here. So the auditory information comes in from the primary auditory cortex and then goes to Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area, essentially, imagine that interprets this auditory information and starts to translate it into language, if you like. It starts to understand what those sound patterns mean. And then Wernicke's area needs to communicate with Broca's area if we are to repeat this word. So then, through the Arcuate Fasciculus, Wernicke's area sends that language information to Broca's area. Broca's area speaks the language of the motor cortex, and it is able to tell the motor cortex to produce a pattern of muscle contractions that will produce the sound of that word that was previously heard. So Broca's area then sends a set of impulses to the primary motor cortex that drives the facial and laryngeal muscles, resulting in repetition of a heard word. Now, specifically, this test, repeat this word, is actually a very good test of the function of the Arcuate Fasciculus. And this damage specifically to the Arcuate Fasciculus results in this particular deficit. Patients cannot repeat a word that you have said to them. Next, let's think about the pathway for speaking a written word. So for speaking out loud, for narrating in a play, for example, something like that. So we'll put on Wernicke's area here in the superior temporal lobe. We'll put on Broca's area here in the inferolateral frontal lobe, and we'll connect the two with the Arcuate Fasciculus. So, speaking a written word, well, when we read, obviously we're using our visual system, and as far as the cortex is concerned, the visual cortex is back here in the occipital lobe. So the visual pattern, if you like, corresponding to a word, is found back here. That information is sent from the visual cortex to Wernicke's area. And Wernicke's area is then able to examine that pattern of impulses that have come from the visual system and interpret that pattern as language, as a word. It's then able to send that word to Broca's area, which is able then to instruct the primary motor cortex to produce a pattern of muscular contraction in order to produce the sound of that word that you have read. What about the pathway for speaking a thought? This is a slightly whimsical example, but still interesting to do. Put on Wernicke's area here, superior temporal lobe. Broca's area here, inferolateral frontal lobe. Arcuate Fasciculus here, connecting the two. Now, a thought, I'm going to say essentially that thoughts can arise from a whole lot of different brain regions, but they can be thought of as converging on Wernicke's area. Okay, so I'm thinking of thought as the collective function of the entirety of the cerebral cortex. These thought patterns then will converge on Wernicke's area, which interprets them, converts them into language, if you like, which it then sends on to Broca's, and then Broca's sends information to the primary motor cortex, instructing it to produce a pattern of muscle contraction. So the reason for doing this little exercise has actually mainly been just to get you rehearsing where Broca's and Wernicke's areas are as much as anything else. And I think it's important that you have a decent appreciation for where these are physically sited within the brain. One final thing before we leave this is that really it's not just Broca's and Wernicke's area. These are small, well-defined regions of the brain, Broca's and Wernicke's areas. But in fact, what we now know is that really they're part of a much bigger network. We said before that the arcuate fasciculus can in fact be bidirectional. Furthermore, the expressive speech area is much more than Broca's. And the receptive speech or receptive language area is much more than Wernicke's. So really, the modern concept of language processing is really that the whole left hemisphere has a large language network within it. However, the model that I've given to you gives us a good clinical working model for localizing lesions in the language system. Now, what do deficits in language sound like? Well, I've got two videos to show you of patients, and we'll listen to these videos and make a few comments about what their language function is like. The first one is a video of a patient suffering from Wernicke's aphasia. So this is damage to Wernicke's area, damage to the receptive language areas. So let's listen to this. So this patient, Byron, had Wernicke's aphasia. And you need to notice a few things about his language function. First thing to note is that his speech was in fact remarkably fluent. He spoke really fluently. There was no jitteriness, no hesitation. He spoke confidently and fluently. However, what he was saying didn't make any sense at all. And in fact, if you did try to listen to the things he was saying, it was pretty clear that he wasn't understanding the things that the interviewer was asking him. Okay? So he very clearly had an intact Broca's area because his speech was fluent. He was able to produce speech very well, but he wasn't understanding what was being asked of him at all, really. And that kind of resulted in his answers becoming nonsensical. So this is a lovely example of Wernicke's aphasia. Now let's take a look at Broca's aphasia caused by damage to Broca's area. So, in this patient's case, I think it was quite clear that she had no problem with understanding the questions that were being asked of her. And it's clear that she was very keen to try to answer them. So she had good comprehension, implying that Wernicke's area was working for her. However, when she was trying to articulate her answer, she was really struggling. She was hesitant, she had a paucity of words, and she was really struggling to get her answers across. And this is typical of Broca's aphasia, where this region that's important for the production of language isn't working properly. Furthermore, it should be quite sobering to the younger members of the audience that even someone of the age of 19 can suffer from a stroke. So stroke is a devastating condition which can affect all age groups, unfortunately. So that's the end of this section on cerebral asymmetry and language. Thank you for listening.